So, okay, let's talk about white people, because there is no question that they are the origin, that the mentality that I'm talking about originates with those people from Europe. So let's talk about it.
Okay, so where do we start? Where do we start? I suppose the first thing that you have to do is actually relocate the conversation about so-called white people into some semblance of reality. And see, this is what you always have to do, subhanAllah. This is what you always have to do with Americans and with Westerners generally. You always have to state the obvious. They make you state the obvious. There's no way whatsoever to talk about anything within their frameworks. Within their frameworks, you can't talk about anything, because the starting point of all of their discussions always is far off from anything like reality, anything even resembling reality. They start from a point of hallucination. They start from a point of fiction. They start from a point of fantasy. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting because they've got you always having to argue your way back to the obvious. You always have to argue your way back. There's never been a people, subhanAllah, in history that I know of that is so contentious about basic factual reality. They waste everybody's time, and they derail any intellectual or any serious discussion always by just the continuous litigation of things that are actually common knowledge. The litigation of things that are actually common sense, self-evident truth. This is part of what I mean about why no normal people in the world can ever usefully engage with Americans or with Westerners generally. You can't. Because you enter every single interaction, Westerners, you enter every single interaction by insulting our intelligence. I've said this before. This is one of the things that you really need to know about them. This is something that you really must know about Americans and about Westerners. Every interaction is always and only used by them as an opportunity to validate themselves and validate their fabricated frameworks. This is literally the only thing that they're interested in, always, at all times. This is why you hear me using the caveat or using the qualifier so-called so many times when I talk. So-called civilization, so-called white, so-called black, so-called race, so-called enlightenment, and what have you. Because none of these things are real things. These are all things that are just elements in their frameworks. And those frameworks are intended to obscure reality. They're false claims. You understand? So whenever I use those terms, or whenever I refer to those things, I always try to remember to add that qualifier or add that caveat. Because we do have to try to anchor our conversation as much as possible in actual reality. And that includes denying the reality of their unreality, because they always occupy an intellectual position of unreality on every single issue. The so-called rational, so-called reasoning, scientific method following West. So we have to start with the reality. We have to start with the reality. And even with that, there are layers. There are layers in this reality, okay? So there's no such thing as white people. Physically, I'm saying. Physically. You know, I remember reading the transcripts of Stephen Biko's trial, and no one said it better than him. White people, physically, are generally pink more than anything else, or beige maybe. So-called black people are just different shades of brown. I mean, I know it might seem pedantic or what have you to mention something like this. It might seem petty to mention this, but again, let's try to bring things back to reality. Actual black and actual white, black and white are opposites. So there's an embedded implication when you talk about people being white and black. You understand me? So again, I mean, I'm sorry, but this is what I mean. This is exactly what I mean. Their frameworks are layer upon layer upon layer of dishonesty and unreality. I wouldn't have to pick apart so much if there wasn't so much to pick apart. You understand me? So physically, white is not a real category. Humans don't come in these colors. We're not birds or something. Cats or dogs or what have you. Human beings don't come in those colors. So let's dispense with that false construction from the outstart. It's moronic. And it only exists for political and economic reasons. For ideological functions in service to political and economic reasons. Now again, I'll repeat, because you did invent these categories and this method of compartmentalization and discrimination, and because your society actively treats people according to these categories, so-called black and so-called white, they exist as real things in these terms. Because you act like any of this is real, because you act like it's real, so now you have created very different experiences for people, which means different histories for people, different communities, different identities, and so forth, all on the basis of your fabricated categories. So we have to make that distinction. In reality, in actual reality, so-called black and so-called white do not exist among humankind. But because you treat them like they do, because you classify human beings this way, now you force this to become an experiential reality for people. You understand? Now it is an experience that people have in this world, have in their lives, in their minds, in their psyches, in their identities, all based on a completely warped and entirely unjustifiable framework. See, you created this problem for mankind. You created this problem for mankind. Because before you created this problem, people just came from different places. People just had different physical characteristics. People had different backgrounds, different heritage, different lineage, different cultures and so forth, different languages, different customs, different practices, different beliefs and what have you. And human beings all around the world just acknowledge the obvious reality that people who come from different places and come from different environments and come from different climates, they have their own qualities. And generally speaking, it was inconsequential to most people how people looked. That wasn't considered a particularly interesting aspect of any qawm, of any folk, of any nation, of any people. I mean, do you understand, as a so-called racial category, as an identity, as a thing that means something, that's supposed to mean something about who you are and about who you're supposed to be loyal to and about what group you belong to, the so-called concept of whiteness is only about 350, 400 years old. That's it. That's the whole lifespan of this supposedly fundamental, self-evident category of human beings. 350 years, maybe 400 years or so. I mean, in the full scope, in the full sweep of recorded human history, that's nothing. I mean, yes, of course, like I said, people would notice lighter or darker complexion. They would notice that for as far back as people had lighter or darker complexion and eyes to see it with. But it wasn't a source of identity. It wasn't a source of categorization or a reason for categorization. And certainly not anything hierarchical. It was not a racial, so-called racial concept. Like there was no pan-European white race or something. That didn't exist. It was just an incidental feature, a superficial feature, believed by most people to be climate-related or location-related or so forth. See, you didn't even come up with this foolishness until your so-called enlightenment. That's when you came up with this foolishness, when you got enlightened. You had this racial epiphany, and it just happened to coincide with colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. What a coincidence. Before that, Europeans didn't think of themselves as white. Not once, not ever. The English thought of themselves as English. The Irish thought of themselves as Irish. The Germans thought of themselves as German, and the French thought of themselves as French, and so forth. There was no white brotherhood, no shared white culture. They despised each other. They detested each other. Genuinely, deeply, violently, generationally, they despised each other. There was no such thing as pan-European solidarity. There was no white fraternity. That never existed in history. There was centuries upon centuries of tribal hatred, border raiding, religious slaughter, dynastic warfare, and the systematic exploitation of every neighboring group whenever the opportunity presented itself. The 100 Years' War, that was England and France on and off for over a century, for 100 years. The 30 Years' War, it was so the 30 Years' War was so destructive that it killed somewhere between 25% to 40% of the entire population of Germany, what's now Germany. Europeans doing that to other Europeans. So-called white people doing that to other so-called white people. The War of the Roses. Butchering each other for a crown, for the throne. The English occupation of Ireland. That happened centuries before they ever went to Africa or anywhere else. With the same logic of extraction and displacement and engineered famine, they perfected that on the Irish people, white people so-called. White people being colonized by so-called white people. There's your Aryan brotherhood. So let's get clear. Let's get clear on what Europe actually was before the concept of whiteness was invented. Because it is a completely invented concept. For most of recorded European history, the overwhelming majority of Europeans lived in abysmal squalor. Absolutely abysmal squalor. You can't imagine the conditions. You would recognize it today as extreme poverty if it even exists anywhere today. I'm talking about a level of destitution that's difficult to comprehend from a modern point of view, from a modern vantage point. Medieval European peasants, and peasants was most of them, the vast majority, about 4 out of every 5 people was a peasant, they lived in a one-room hut. Dirt floors. They shared it with their livestock. Literally. Their animals slept in the same space that they slept in for warmth. Sleeping with your goats and sleeping with your pigs. That's your history. The average life expectancy at birth was in the mid-30s. Half of all children died before the age of 5. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. Famine was absolutely common. It was routine. The Great Famine of the early 14th century killed 10 to 15% of all of Europe's entire population. Then the Black Death came, the bubonic plague. And that took out another third, or some say up to a half of the population of Europe. These are the conditions that they came from. So understand the real history of the people that we're talking about here. Okay? There was never in history some kind of block of so-called white unity or white fraternity. Nobody ever thought like that. Nobody had anything even remotely like that in their minds. And during all that time, by the way, the church, your church, they owned up to a third of all the land in Europe. The aristocracy owned almost everything else. And the peasants worked the land. They couldn't leave the land. They had to pay tithes to the church. They had to pay taxes to the feudal lord. They couldn't leave the land. They couldn't even get married without permission. They were literally legally bound to the soil, not metaphorically, legally bound. You were a serf. You were a serf. You came with the property. You understand? You came with the property. If the land was sold, you were sold with it. That's your history. You weren't human beings. You were farm tools. You were instruments. Instruments for other people who you would later classify as white, but who did not see you and who did not treat you in any way whatsoever as equals. They didn't even treat you as human beings. They didn't treat you as people. White on white subjugation. White on white predation. That's the history of Europe. That's the history of Europe. White on white violence. White on white war, conflict, and strife. And if you're paying attention, that's Europe's future too. That's their future too. That's where they're going. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that not much at all has changed. Even after they started calling themselves so-called white instead of calling themselves English, or calling themselves white instead of French or German or what have you. The same system is essentially what you have right now in America. That's the feudal system. Europe's great civilizational achievement, the feudal system, before they went out and colonized everyone else. And that's still what you have today. In fact, it's the only organizational approach that you have to your societies, centuries later. Now, I've talked before about how in Europe, across Europe, before Christianity, these people were pagans. They worshipped the jinn. They had relationships with the jinn, with the shayateen. That's not me saying so. This is the historical record. This is the historical record. The Germanic tribes, Odin, Thor, they had blood sacrifices. Yes, blood sacrifices. They did that. They did animals mostly, but they also did human sacrifices, and that is documented. They sacrificed human beings. The Norse people too. Seasonal ritual offerings, that included humans. The Vikings or whatnot, we all know they used to hurl old people off of the mountaintops. When they got too old, they'd throw them off a cliff. You had the Druids among the Celtic people. They had these large wicker structures into which they would put human beings, and they would set them on fire, burn them alive as offerings. Oh, these were brutal people. The devils that they worshiped commanded them to do all sorts of heinous things. This is the history. The days of the week in English still carry the names of their pagan gods, the Germanic false gods. Wednesday is Woden's day. Thursday is Thor's day for Thor. Friday is Frigg's day. Saturday is Saturn, the day for Saturn. Your calendar is an artifact of your mushrik satanic history. You can't deny it. And Christianity, when it came to Europe, it did not actually displace any of this. It adapted to it, or rather it got adapted by it. European Christianity is very foreign to what they practice in the region where Nabi Isa, where Prophet Jesus actually lived. I mean, calling their religion Christianity is like saying that Pat Boone's version of Little Richard songs sounds the same. You still had idol worship. You still had polytheism, praying to Mary, praying to saints and whatnot. Your pagan festivals got Christian names. Your pagan sacred sites got churches built on top of them. And the folk traditions, the charms, the hexes, the magical beliefs, the nature worship and whatnot, all of this persisted for centuries underneath the official religion. And in fact, they still do persist. You have to take note of that. It's very important to take note of that. I told you before, you know, people talk about China, people talk about India or Egypt or what have you, but Europe probably has the longest continuous congruent culture on the earth. They have been incredibly resistant to changing or developing. It's astonishing. Whatever comes to them becomes like them, or else they'll fight tooth and nail against it. This is a culture that cannot be reformed. It cannot be reformed. It can only be papered over. That's all they've ever done. They rebrand, but they don't change. There's only ever been cosmetic changes to that culture. And this is extremely important for you to understand, because it's a serious mistake to think that so-called Western civilization is a modern thing. People think of it like that. People think of it like that, as if Europeans just suddenly sprang forth as a totally changed people after the Dark Ages. You know, they sprang forth as these great enlightened, rational, scientific, humanitarian thinkers or something out of nowhere. You know, they like to partition their history like that. They like to partition their history. There was the before and there's the after. That's this sort of partitioning. That was then, this is now. Let's not talk about the then. But no, understand, this is an ancient people. This is an ancient people, and they are more resistant to change and more resistant to reform and rehabilitation than any other people on the face of this earth. You think industrialization changed them? Like, as soon as they got machines and as soon as they got gunpowder, somehow that caused a sudden, rapid maturation process, a refinement and advancement in their character? No, not at all. You know how like the West, the term the West is synonymous with modernity, as if some highly advanced, you know, intelligent life form, some extraterrestrial life forms landed in Europe in the 1800s, and they have no other history before that. No, this is a people, the European people, this is a people who are ancient, and whose ways and whose culture has remained absolutely consistent for the last 10,000 years. I'm telling you, things that they were doing and ways that they were acting 10,000 years ago, they were doing those same things 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, and this morning. They're pre-modern in the modern age. It's 2026, but they're still prehistoric. I'm telling you, in their minds. So you understand, I'm talking about the origins of the culture, the origins of the system that you're all in over there in America right now. The origins and the originators. And that's the culture and that's the system that all of you have absorbed, that all of you have been affected and infected by. No matter where you sit in the social and economic hierarchy of that country, it doesn't matter. Yes, it doesn't matter. You're seeing the world through a prehistoric lens. And it's not even the lens of your own original culture. The original lens of your own actual people, if you're a so-called minority in America, a member of the global majority in America. That lens has been grafted onto your perspective. Now you can't even see through your own natural eyes anymore. You only see through their eyes. See, everything that Europe was about for the last 10 millennia, they brought that over to America when they started that mess. Except that they honed it, they streamlined it, they whittled it down to its core base components. America is the concentrated version. And with every single year, every passing year, they get more and more down to the bone about it. They get more and more down to the bone. They whittle it more down. I'm telling you that they're going more and more back to the original version, the 10,000 years ago version. And you know that occult tradition I was talking about with the jinn worship in Europe, that didn't die out with so-called modernity and the Industrial Revolution and whatever, the Satanism, the jinn worship and what have you. No, it went covert. It went covert, and then it re-emerged in like the 18th century, 19th century. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the Hermetic Order, Aleister Crowley, Theosophy, I've talked about that before. This is all European. All emerging from what their scholars call the Western esoteric tradition, which is nothing but a continuous thread running from pre-Christian paganism through the Renaissance, to the occult revival, into the modern secret societies that were behind, or that shaped anyway, the founding of America itself. I mean, you know that the founding fathers were not what you would call orthodox or normal Christians. Many of them were so-called deists. A significant number of them were Freemasons. Washington was, Franklin was, Hamilton was, and so forth. Okay, so that's your founding spiritual heritage. Again, these are just historical facts. This is just for the record and from the record. This is the background. This is the genealogy of your society. You know, what I talked about before, when someone online is wearing filters, or someone has had extensive cosmetic surgery done to try to make themselves look more beautiful than they really are, than they are naturally. Well, there are two underlying elements to that, or maybe three, motives, I mean, not elements, motives. One is a sense of inadequacy, and the other is envy. And the third motive is that old predatory motive, you know, the filter as camouflage, as a hunting strategy. Look like what you're not, because if you look like what you are, you won't be able to get close to your prey. So you have to change your appearance and make yourself prettier. So the envy is real, the civilizational envy is real, and the sense of inadequacy is real. The European Renaissance, so-called, they'll tell you that that was the great sort of spontaneous flowering of great Western genius. But no, the Renaissance was a copy and paste project. That was copy and paste. Arabic texts were translated into Latin in Toledo and in Sicily. The Islamic world had preserved and had corrected and had improved Greek philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, while the Europeans were in what they called their Dark Ages, while they were still in their Dark Ages. They called it the Dark Ages because Europe was dark. The rest of the world wasn't dark. Baghdad wasn't dark. They had the House of Wisdom that was producing brilliant scholars, one after another. Cordoba was the most literate city in all of Europe because of us. We made it that, with libraries that dwarfed anything available in the rest of the continent, in Europe or in France, in UK, what have you. While they were still defecating where they stood, their aristocrats were defecating where they stood, their peasants were dying of disease and being told by their priests that the earth was the center of the universe. We gave you algebra. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine was the standard medical textbook in European universities all the way up until the 17th century. The numerals that you use, the Arabic numerals, they're Arabic numerals, and that came to you through the Islamic world from India. The concept of zero, without which your entire computational civilization is impossible, that came by that same route. The navigational tools that enabled European exploration, the astrolabe, and so forth, improvements to the compass and so on, all of that came from us. All of that came from the Muslim world, from the Islamic world, and you took it. Paper came from China, also through the Islamic world to Europe. And then you used that paper to write your claims of civilizational superiority. And then after having absorbed all of this information that we provided to you, after you translated it, after you adapted it, and in most cases you did not credit the source of it, Europe then got to proclaim itself as the summit, the pinnacle of human achievement. The Athens miracle, the Greek miracle, Western tradition, which later became great white tradition, all rising up from the brilliant philosophers of Athens. The irony is that when you came up with the concept of whiteness, Greeks themselves weren't even included as white. You know, you talk about Rome, but you didn't even consider Italians as white either. Yes, you didn't even think of the people who you now hail as the originators of white Western civilization, the Athenians and the Romans. You didn't even consider those people as white. See, this is another layer of the unreality in your frameworks. The precise origin of the racial concept is documented. We know Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676. Black and white indentured servants, both of them indentured servants, enslaved Africans and poor European workers, united in an armed uprising against the planter class. They burned down Jamestown. They terrified the colonial elite, because what they demonstrated was that class was more real to these people than the color line. Poor Europeans and enslaved Africans had more in common with each other than they had in common with the people at the top, than they had with the plantation owners. So the elite manufactured a solution. They created race. And within 30 years of the Bacon's Revolution, or Rebellion, Virginia had passed the slave codes of 1705, legally defining who was white and what whites were entitled to, and what Africans could be subjected to. For the first time in legal history, white appeared as a formal category with attached privileges. In exchange for those privileges, they were conscripted into the enforcement of the racial order. That's what whiteness is. That's what whiteness is at its origin. It's not a biological fact, obviously. It's not even a cultural heritage. It's a loyalty badge. It's an agreement between the planter class and the poor European workers. We will give you a psychological wage. We'll give you a status, a rung above someone else on the ladder. And in exchange for that, you agree to defend the system that is also exploiting you. Because at least you're not at the bottom, so be thankful for that. David Roediger called this the wages of whiteness. W.E.B. Du Bois identified it even before him. Read Theodore Allen. He documented it extensively. Theodore Allen. The mechanism is not disputed. This is a historical reality. And from that point on, whiteness was elastic. The definition of who counted as white would shift based on the needs of the economy and the needs of the political moment. The Irish, my ancestors, they came to America in the millions, fleeing from the Great Famine, which wasn't a famine at all. It was an imposed starvation, because occupied white Ireland, occupied by the white English, they were forced to export their food to white England because the British needed their grain more than the Irish apparently needed to live. 1 million Irish people died. Another 1 million of them emigrated. And when they arrived in America, they were not considered white. You see political cartoons from Harper's Weekly that depicted them with ape-like features, alongside similar caricatures of black Americans. They were called white Negroes. Frederick Douglass, when he met the Irish in Ireland, he saw for himself what the British colonialism had done to them, and he said it wasn't very much different from what had been done to his people. He couldn't help but note the irony of the Irish immigrants arriving in America and immediately taking the side of the slaveholders so that they could claim the privilege of whiteness that they had been denied at home. The Irish became white in America by doing what whiteness required, distancing themselves from black Americans, so-called black Americans, filling the police forces, and enforcing the racial order. See, they paid the admission price. And this, by the way, no matter how many St. Patty's Day parades you hold over there in America, no matter how much green beer you drink, no matter how many shamrocks you plaster on your jacket, this behavior of the Irish immigrants coming to America has alienated the Irish in Ireland from Irish Americans forever, because they adopted the oppressor's lens. They absorbed the oppressor's culture. And like I say, even the Italians were not white. In the American South, listen to this, in the American South in the late 19th century, Italians, particularly from the southern part of Italy, they were classified somewhere between white and black. They lived in black neighborhoods. They were basically segregated in terms of where they lived. They worked alongside black workers. They were sometimes subject to the same Jim Crow restrictions. And in 1891, in New Orleans, 11 Italian immigrants were dragged from a prison by a mob, and they were all lynched. And this is actually the largest mass lynching in American history, Italians. The men had already been acquitted in court, but it didn't matter. They were acquitted, but it didn't matter. The mob came for them anyway, and that mob was led by some of the most prominent citizens in New Orleans. Citizens who later became mayors, who later became governors and renowned politicians. I bet you didn't know that that's the origin of Columbus Day, the lynching of Italian Americans. Yes. Because it caused an international incident, and the United States government had to pay a small reparation to their families, and as a symbolic concession to Italian Americans, they created Columbus Day as a federal celebration in 1892. Imagine. And that's how Italians became white in America. It's an incoherent concept on every level, I'm telling you. The Polish, the Slavs, the Eastern Europeans, and so forth, they were categorized in the early 20th century by American eugenicists as racially inferior to Northwestern Europeans. You see, I told you they've always detested each other. They can't stand each other. There's a book by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, and they explicitly ranked Eastern Europeans as below the Anglo-Saxons and the Nordics. You know, Trump is going on and on about immigration and so forth, talking about bad hombres, and they're not sending us their best people and so forth, as if the best of any country would ever set foot in America. But there was an immigration act called the Immigration Restriction Act in 1924, and that was specifically designed to limit Eastern European immigration, because they saw Eastern European people as racially undesirable in their country. That's what their so-called scientists told them. Don't even talk about the Jews. The Jews, obviously, they were classed completely separately from all other types of people. Those same eugenicists who ranked the Slavs also ranked the Jews, and they said that they were a distinct and threatening racial category. Madison Grant, Lothrop started the whole American academic mainstream of eugenics. Understand, these were not fringe figures. These were Harvard professors. They were cited by legislators. Think about that when you glorify those Ivy League schools. And when you think about your senators, or you think that your senators or your congresspeople actually stand for some kind of moral values. No, these Neanderthal bigots were among your most celebrated intellectuals, and they were nothing but Neanderthal bigots. Their work was translated into German, and it was praised by Adolf Hitler. He said that he had a debt. He owed a debt to American race science. He said that in Mein Kampf. Speaking of Germans, the Germans are the single largest ancestry group living in America today. Roughly 1 in every 7 Americans has German heritage. I also have German heritage on my mother's side. If you go back far enough, even the Germans themselves were categorized as barbarians. Now, they were pretty much always classified as white. Ever since white became a category, they were pretty much always considered white. But in America, they were subjected to intense suspicion and cultural erasure during both World Wars, World War I and World War II. There were even German Americans who were put into internment camps, like the Japanese were. Okay? Now the English, that's the original template. That's the original WASP template, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's the foundational American identity. I think everyone knows that. That's the official, original version of American whiteness, right? The Puritans of New England, the plantation aristocracy of Virginia, the Scot-Irish that settled in Appalachia and so forth. Those are the ones who later became known as the rednecks or the hillbillies or what have you. These are the building blocks. These are the building blocks of the founding cultural DNA of that country. I'm telling you, forget about white and actually learn about those people's history back where they came from. The Anglo-Saxons, the English, the French, the Germans, right? These are the main groups. These are your main groups in America. The origins of the American psyche. So when you know what they were like back in their lands of origin, if you know what they were like, then it's no wonder that the founding culture of America was built on stolen land, was built on enslaved labor. It was built on a set of decorative ideological documents declaring all men created equal, while viewing only their own kindred as men, their only skin tone as men. Understand, this isn't hypocrisy, not in the ordinary sense. No, they're being completely consistent. They're being completely consistent with their ancestral culture and their ancestral thinking. Dehumanization is an unspoken but fully understood and fully accepted component of their framing of equality. See, they'll say all people are equal, but what they won't say, but what they believe, is that not all people are people.
So guys, that is Professor Shahid Bolsen for you. And I know you like his videos. We have been having discussions on his videos in the past, and you enjoyed them, and some of you actually left comments on how you like him, how you like how he articulates himself, how he explains his points, you know. So that's why I did this video for you. So you have heard what he's saying, you know. Basically, he's trying to explain the idea that white people and whiteness and how they perceive black people. That for white people, you know, they are unable to be fair when it comes to sharing resources with black people, you know, like living this life and sharing in this world with black people and with other races. They have grown in a kind of mentality where they think that black people are less deserving of the good things in life, that anything that is bad, anything that is wrong belongs to black people. And that is not the truth. So Professor Bolsen is trying to explain these things out to them, that they need to be looking at everything they say in depth. They need to focus on getting their facts right, because for example, when you're talking about things like a history, you know, the history of black people, you're reading a history that is written from someone that was using the lens of a white person, you know. You're using the perspective of a white person to write the black experiences. And that is definitely distorted, and everything that is written in there is biased, you know. You do not expect such a person to be fair. And one thing about white people is they do not know and understand the idea of fairness. To them, as long as something benefits them more than it benefits any other race, and especially black people, then that thing is fair. And that is the mentality they live in the past, present, and even the coming future. If they do not change, that is who they are going to be, because they're always thinking they're better than black people, they're better than Asians, they're better than, you know, any people from the other races. As long as you're not white, then you are not as privileged as they. And that is the kind of misinformation that we keep talking about. These people need to change. They need to address that and talk among themselves, discuss these issues, because while they think they're hurting black people and the people of other races, they're actually hurting themselves as well. Because when you spread misinformation about black people, for example, it affects you in turn. You might not see it directly, but it affects you, because you have grown a society where people know that you keep lying about them. They cannot trust you. We did a video here of black people talking about they can never trust white people. Even if they're close friends, they do not trust them, yeah? If they are friends and they go out to have fun, and white girls start getting drunk, black boys say they would run away. They would not be there. They would not stay there because they know that this is a dangerous moment for them. Now, they have grown knowing that they cannot afford to trust white people. And that is the main point. That when they keep hurting black people, hurting the people of the other races, in turn they're hurting themselves. And that is the point they do not realize. So white people need to do a bit about them being fair, sharing this world and the resources of this world equally with the other people from the other races, because we are all supposed to be here, the same way that you came to this world is the same way we all came here. So you need to work on that and make sure that all the activities that you're doing, all your engagements, all your interactions, you are making sure that you're becoming a better person, becoming a better human being, doing things differently. We cannot afford to do things the same way our ancestors did, be it for black people or for white people. We cannot afford to do the same things and expect different results. It doesn't work that way. If you want anything to be different, if you want different results, if you want things to become better tomorrow or even today, you have to do things differently. Now, that is the message that Shahid Bolsen has for white people. And yeah, it is beautiful that we have such white people that actually care about black people, and they're ready to speak up. They're ready to say it as it is. They're ready to speak the truth, as long as it's the truth, nothing but the whole truth. They're willing to share it out to the world. They're willing to go against their own. They're willing to call out their own because they stand for fairness. And I would like to urge all white people that are watching me right now, stand for justice, stand for fairness, stand for the truth. As long as you know something is true, as long as you know that this person is being hurt for no apparent reason, they do not deserve this kind of treatment, stand up for them, because that is the only way that we can help each other. That's the only way that we can become a better world as a whole. So and for black people as well, I know there are black people that are racist against white people, and we do not condone that. We do not say that that is correct. It's not. We call it out for what it is. It is wrong, and you should not be discriminating on anyone because of skin color. Yeah, mere skin color, no. Maybe something like their character or anything serious, yeah. But skin color, it is very unfair for you to do that, whether you're a white person or a black person. And yeah, basically that's it. So guys, if you're watching me for the first time, my name is Furaha, and kindly consider subscribing if you like this kind of content. Also go to my playlist down below, watch the rest of the videos that I have done in the past. If you are like-minded, also you can consider sharing to your friends, family, you can leave a comment on this comment section. Let me know what you think about what Professor Shahid Bolsen is saying in this video. And also, if you agree to what he's saying, you can leave a comment. If you do not agree to what he's saying and you have better ideas or points, also you can feel free to share in the comment section. It's good to learn, it's good to unlearn, it's good to relearn. So yeah, I'm hoping to hear from you guys. I love when you are interacting in the comment section. It helps me to fuel myself up more for making more videos. So returning subscribers, I am not going to forget you. Thank you so much for always choosing to be part of this amazing family. And yeah, you can share this video to your friends. Also, let's grow the community. Guys, I will see you on my next video. So bye for now.